King Lear, Act 3, Scene 2. King Lear to the fool in the storm. Blow winds! Crack your cheeks! Rage! Blow! Till you have drenched our steeples, drowned our cocks. Oh, you sulphurous and thought-executing fires! Vaunt couriers to oak-cleaving thunderbolts, come, singe my white head! Oh, you all-shaking thunder! Crack nature's molds, strike flat the thick rotundity of the earth, and let all the Germans spill at once that make ingrateful man. Scene? I was actually really hoping I could get all of you outside just because it is so awesome outside with the clouds and everything. But then I thought about how quickly ad tech and brand people move, and I was like, yeah, it's not going to work. So today what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about the story behind how WeatherFX came to be, because it's a slightly different story from some of the others that are out there in automation and programmatic. And so I thought I would take Brian and Nick's first rule, which is never put up a fucking sales deck, and I'd put up my fucking sales deck. But what I would do is put up these really ugly red notes that I have made about each of the slides from my sales deck, and actually tell you about the story of how we got here. So it's taken us about 2 years to build out WeatherFX. And we started with this awesome Excel project roadmap, right, which is how all these things start. It was a bunch of us in like this sad little space. There was 4 of us. We didn't know what the fuck we were doing. I had been brought in from Thomson Reuters. My background is primarily in data. And I was told, I'll do something with weather. We'll give you some money, and we'll see how it goes. And so we pretended like this was what we were going to build. And we went out and told a bunch of clients, it's already ready. It's ready to go. Look at this. We have a project roadmap. We got triggers, we got an enterprise class professional product, and look, we threw in the word programmatic so you'd get confused. And that's how these things typically tend to start, right? But then now we have this super duper, we have a designer, we have all this kind of cool shit, and we've put together this slide that has icons everywhere, and it shows all these cool weather conditions coming into the WeatherFX piece, and then going out to all the screens that we represent. And you know, we happen to be one of the largest cross-platform publishers out there, but we never thought that that was going to be good enough. Because when we looked around and looked at what was happening with publishers, all we saw was sort of death and destruction, right? Especially in the CPM world. And so what we decided to do was to find what we wanted to do and then stick to it. So this slide was about, we just finished it out. This slide was from 713, and it has almost exactly the same things, right? We're taking in a bunch of really interesting data points, our weather data, hyperlocal information, a whole bunch of seasonality that we worked out with our media buyers, some really cool proprietary sales data, and we managed to get some amazing clients to give them to us. They've been talking about it quite a bit in the press, so I won't talk about it for them. And we output a series of things, cool, creative, interesting stories. We connected to a whole bunch of different kinds of ways to talk to our consumers, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we get into it. But this was essentially what we talked about in the middle of 2013. This is what we talked about at the beginning of 2013. It's exactly the same thing. What was amazing for me was we put together a bunch of things in December of 2012. We put together 10 slides, and those 10 slides have never changed. All we've done is update them. And I've been working in this business for about 15 years. I have never had an opportunity to do that. To say, this is what I'm going to build. It's badly organized, it's poorly graphic designed, and it says 10 things. And then we actually went out, we built it, and it worked. That was astounding for me. Along with that, we had to tell 2 stories. Because like all publishers, we have a user base that cares a lot about how we interact with them. They care about how our app works. They care about what our channel looks like. They care about how quickly they can come in and get information. And so there was one story we had to tell about how we were using this data in privacy-friendly ways, and we had to talk to the consumer about it. And so there were some stories that ran. There's a good example that ran in the Wall Street Journal where they talked about all the cool, fun things that we came up with when we were generating weather insights, right? And some of them were things like, in Dallas, we found that there was a particular dew point at which sales of bug repellent just blew up. And we couldn't figure out why, right? And in the end, we figured out what was actually happening at that dew point was that insect eggs were hatching. Right? It was one of these cool science meets consumer stories that everybody loves. But the funny part to that is, for that one cool story, we have tens of thousands of outputs where my data scientists get into huge fights with our creative guys saying, look, it shouldn't matter to you why sales are blowing up. All that should matter to you is when these conditions occur, people start buying strawberries, they start buying sweaters, they start buying umbrellas, and that's all that should matter. And what was really interesting about that is over the course of those 2 years, when we first started out, when we wanted to link data, an automated platform, and creative, which is what a lot of us are trying to do, because the creative part often gets forgotten, we actually put a lot of weather into the creative, right? We wanted the creative to show rain. We wanted the creative to show snow. We wanted the creative to show sun. And what we realized was we don't need to do that. If you walk out of this room, there is rain. There is sun. There is cloud cover. We don't have to show any of that in the creative. And over the 2 years, everything changed in terms of how flexible the creative agencies we worked with were able to be in terms of what they could do with the insights that we generated. The other story that we had to tell, obviously, was the innovation story. That was a much easier story to tell because I'm a fantastic storyteller. I'm a terrible data scientist. I was an art history major, and nobody knows any of this stuff. So we did both of those two things, and we were able to talk to both the industry and to our consumers at the same time about how we were taking data insights from weather and we were automating it for a media platform. And it started with very, very simple revelations, very simple things that we found. And these are things that we still talk about with our clients today. This is one of the 10 slides that I talked about. Though, to be fair, when we first put the deck together, this slide was 7 different slides. And all it was trying to say was, when it's January, and it is 34 degrees in Chicago and 34 degrees in Miami, it is two very, very different things, even though it is exactly the same temperature. And from that very, very simple revelation that people tend to react very differently to their environments in different places, we actually were able to build a story that became this, right? A very, very simple notion that we can put together effectively real-time data, real-time media messaging, and the power of location, all buzzwords that everybody right now loves because we have systems that can actually do this in real time, pull a story, push it out, and look at performance, all in sort of in nanoseconds, which we haven't been able to do to this point. This was the same slide from 113. Everything we knew then, we knew now. Everything we figured out then, we still use today. And that allowed us to be very, very flexible with what we were able to do because nothing changed with the base story. The base story was we're using weather. What we didn't talk about was the fact that about half my team, and the team now it's creeping up on 80 people, happens to be from the ad technology and data space. Right? These are people who have been used to working with not just weather data, and they don't work with just weather data. We work with all forms of data that you guys have been talking about today and will continue to talk about. We work with social data. We work with all kinds of demographic and psychographic information. We work with a whole variety of particular intent-based information. I spend a lot of time at both BlueKai and Audience Science, as did a lot of my team. We know a lot about how a lot of those data points work together, but we never talk about them. Because in the end, you have to talk about what you own. And what we own is weather, in a way that's probably larger than any single vertical elsewhere. We own it fundamentally through the brand. We own it because we've been able to walk out with a platform that our Fortune 100 marketers have jumped on top of. And we own it because we have the best forecast in the world. For those of you who might doubt that, we're about to roll out something called Forecast on Demand. And until now, we had about 2.5 million points of information that we would gather every day to actually generate a weather forecast. We're about to move to about 3.5 billion points of information, which allows us to generate a forecast for every point of latitude and longitude that your phone can pull up. I didn't cite that example by coincidence. We're doing it because, like everybody else, we know the future is in mobile. We have 140 million app downloads of our mobile application. We also own a company called Weather Underground that some of you might use if you're a serious weather wonk. And actually, Forecast on Demand has been live on Weather Underground for some time. So for those of you who are wondering why the San Francisco forecast is always better on Weather Underground, it's not just because they're in San Francisco and there are a bunch of really serious weather wonks. It's because we've been working really hard on making sure we have the best forecast in the world. The point I'm trying to make there is that we needed to hide a lot of the complexity within automation, within programmatic, in the story we told. And so we decided to ground that story in the notion that weather is what's important. Weather is what impacts how consumers make decisions. And it allowed us to tell a much broader story about how we can help marketers deliver against their goals, rather than explaining to them how ad technology worked. Either they know or they don't give a shit. Those are the two camps they're in. So all the complexity around, we track almost 90 variables from 3.5 billion points across the globe. All of that became this slide, right? We're interested in being local because without being local, weather is not relevant. We're interested in being recent because any real-time platform has to be. And in some cases, if we're not exactly real-time, the actual push doesn't work. Volatility is an interesting space for us. We own extreme weather. And unfortunately for the last, or fortunately, depending on how you think about it, for the last 2 years, we've had the least hurricanes since 1948, 2 years in a row. That's been interesting for us. There are two other things that we care about as well. Understanding what current weather looks like and what the current forecast looks like. For those of you who saw the Bill Belichick piece where there's a coach who talked about the fact that all meteorologists got the weather wrong, we actually had one of our meteorologists get up and actually show them what the 2-day forecast looked like for all the NFL games around the time he said that meteorologists got it all wrong. And the percent variance was 1.4% with a 2-day forecast. And for those of you who don't know what that means, 50 years ago, if there was a hurricane heading your way, you wouldn't know what was happening until it hit your home. Now we can actually give you a pretty good assessment at least 3 days out. Keep going. So once again, nothing changed in the way we were thinking about this. This was 6/13 from last year. We talked exactly the same way about what we were doing. And partially, the story behind a strong programmatic platform is being consistent about how you message to your marketers and to the agencies who work with them as an extension of their thinking and an extension of their execution. What we were telling them is, much like search, much like social, you need to be thinking about weather not just as a particular part of your strategy, but as a strategy. And the only way we could do that was to use the same precepts again and again and again and again, and the campaigns had to work. Without each of those things happening, we couldn't win. The other thing we did was we took our actual architecture slides and we simplified them, right? To a point of almost absurdity. When you look at what you see on the board before you, we at one point walked in with, and some of you tech companies are completely guilty of this, right? I was guilty of this when I worked in technology. When I thought that all the brands I was speaking to really cared about my uptime and really cared about how complex my system was. And all they really cared about was who was going to be hands-on keyboard, was it going to work, could it integrate with all the other marketing campaigns they had going on, and how quickly could you get it up and running. And in the end, again, it was simplify, 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 to the point where even a fairly complex tech story could be told. Not a lot of people know what our tech platform is actually constituted of. And it's a combination of homegrown technologies as well as vendors we work with. But we don't talk about them. We let them talk about themselves if they'd like to. But all we really talk about is the weather and the goals. That's it. The other thing that we talk about, which is important to us as a company, is the fact that we can represent all 4 platforms. And we can do that in an automated fashion. And when we first started thinking about this, to harken back to the point I made a little while ago, we have a big network, right? We're the most syndicated national cable network. We have a pretty significant size site with weather.com, and we have Weather Underground as well. We also own a bunch of other weather sites. We also are the back-end data for pretty much any weather source that you can think of. So we're now officially the data for iPhone. We're officially the data for most mobile phones that you use. We're the data for the Google One box. We are the data for Yahoo. weather data for a lot of players that actually work out in the space. But we're OK with that. We want our data to be omnipresent in a lot of ways. But what we also realized was we want our platform to be allowed to be used wherever we needed it as well. There was one other thing, the actual science of how we created triggers. How could we take those weather conditions and actually equate them to how consumers would behave? And there was a lot that went into it. But again, simplify, simplify, simplify. We looked at everything from understanding neurobiologically how it worked to understanding what it would do in terms of hundreds and hundreds of regressions, right? So what were people doing? And we started with sales. So we would take sales data, match it to weather conditions in that location, and see if we could find any correlations. But then we started sort of drifting further and further out to try and figure out how primal this connection was. And some of the things we ran into were fascinating, right? Were there ways that we could take brand pillars and actually link them to emotional state generated by weather? So after 8 days of rain in Seattle, and I've talked about this example a few times now, after 8 days of rain in Seattle, when you have 4 hours of sunshine, can an automated system push out not just a call to action, but an actual brand message around being happy? And can that resonate in a stronger way than it would otherwise resonate? A lot of the notions around real time have been, let's take advantage of situations that happen. I mean, the Oreo one sort of jumps to mind, right? The Super Bowl lights go out, and all these marketers jump into action, and somebody puts out a clever quip about the fact that their brand, which was in no way related to lights going out, could actually relate to lights going out. But that was one big event. What we thought was important was we make decisions all the time, every day. When we wake up, we make decisions about how we're going to get dressed, what we're going to eat, how we're going to get to work, how our kids are going to get to work. And we wanted a platform that could be automated, that could respond to every one of those opportunities. And the primary data insight would be weather-based. But of course, we had to think about the fact that there's a Hispanic 55-year-old woman that we're speaking to. And how do we incorporate that into the system without overcomplicating the situation? So we created science, and then we took that science and we created human triggers, right? And these encompass things like product triggers, which are as simple as if you sell this product, we can activate a trigger for you. We built a piece around what we called relative weather conditions, and I talked about that earlier. It's the notion that we now have hyperlocal models for how populations in one of 4,000 weather zones across the US react to every single skew we have seen across all of our clients. So we literally know in this zip code in Phoenix, Arizona, here is how people react to Argyle sweaters, right? And here is how people will buy them, and here is when people will not. So it didn't become just a play around how quickly can we get to them. It became a play around this is when you should not be selling any media, pushing any media in that area, because there is zero reason to do it. There was a very simple example when we were working with a home improvement company that, and in fact, most every company around this in this space did this, is they thought spring started on the same day across the country. It didn't. It doesn't. And in fact, people are fairly specific about when they believe spring starts. And when you do something silly, like push a campaign that says it is now spring, when there are 6 inches of snow outside somebody's window, you just look ridiculous, right? So the real-time nature suddenly became, don't do stupid shit when you don't have to. The other piece was, how do we get real scale? And I've touched on this a few times, right? So we said, we're going to do everything we can do on property, and we did it. We did mobile, we did digital, we did TV, and then we said, great, now how do we keep going? So we built a DSP. We started buying inventory sort of wherever we needed to. We then built a DSP for television. I'll talk about that in a second. And then we started integrating with where we thought there were interesting ecosystem plays. We did it with Twitter. Our first campaigns have gone live with those. And so in your Twitter feed, you'll start seeing things that don't necessarily call out the weather, but you're going to see those promoted tweets because the weather says so in your area. And it is terrific. It even works on television. So we did this for our own network, where we actually activated bumpers, and specific ads would go live, and specific bumpers and sort of end-of-ad cards would go live, depending on what the weather was in our region. The one really fun part about the Weather Channel was because 30 years ago, we had to build a channel that pushed out a local forecast. We actually are able to break out our feed and our advertising by all the forecast regions that we push local forecasts to. We pre-built for real-time local long before anyone thought we had to. And the other thing we did was we essentially built out a pretty kludgy but workable solution where we're now able to buy network inventory, spot inventory, on other channels because we do think context is important. And it's generated by the same data insights that power everything else. And then we got case study after case study after case study after case study because the shit works. Thank you.